Exciting. Hello, word nerds. Happy Sunday and happy Mother's Day to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on our second ever Word Nerds workshop. Today we will be getting together to talk about all things character creation, which is something I feel like I have a lot to learn about, but we'll see how this goes. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I loved Anne Griswold's comment about I have my character list, a pen and pencil, and a cookie, so she's ready to go, and that seems like a pretty good attitude. I wish I had cookies.
Same. Oh my goodness.
To kick things off, we're just going to have a bit of an opening question for the word nerds of how long do you usually spend building up your characters before you start writing a project? Rachel, we will start with you.
Okay. Oh god. It really varies from like 4 hours to like until the end of the book. So I give them like a good amount of thought, but usually I'll do that once I've already written a bit of their voice, and then I'm like, all right, this person seems like they're gonna stay for a little while, and then I'll go into backstory. So I usually start not knowing too much about them, and then I'll spend like 3 hours like figuring out what they like and making mood boards and what have you. And then sometimes it's like the end of my novel. I'm like, oh, I forgot that this person even needed this trait. So
yeah. Emma, how about you?
I don't spend much conscious time on it. It's a lot of just like while I'm like plotting out the book and figuring out the book, I'll like write down a lot of notes about the character's arc. But things like backstory and what they look like the kind of like character sheet type stuff, I don't spend much time on. Like I was just looking with like my current work in progress, like I have like 1 page about the main character and like half a page about a couple other characters, and that's it. And then I'll like find like some pictures on Pinterest that I'm like, this kind of represents my character a little bit, and that's about all I do.
Megan?
I don't know. I feel like Rachel, I kind of feel like I don't fully know a character until the end of the first draft. But I do like to know a few things before I get started. So I always like to know kind of where they're at emotionally when we start the story and where I want them to end up emotionally. Like what's the thing I want them to figure out about themselves. And one of the things that helps me figure that out is if I know, well, what do they want and what are they really afraid of? And what's the one thing that they will not sacrifice for that thing, so that then I know I can try and make them sacrifice that thing later. And then if it's going to be a point of view character, kind of like what Emma said with like the letting things simmer or whatever, I don't typically start writing a character until I've had some line like pop into my head as I'm thinking about the story of like, oh, this would be a really good first line for that character. For some reason, for me, if I can come up with a first line from that character's point of view, then I feel like I know their voice well enough at least to get started. So not nothing, but it doesn't feel like much.
Yeah, that all sounds pretty thorough. Erin, can I throw a question at you? How you feeling? You ready?
Yeah, go for it.
How much time do you usually spend working on like building your characters before you start a new writing project?
Not at all. I'm one of those people that just like writes the whole story and doesn't really know who the heck I'm writing about until the very end, which often results in me having to go back and do a lot of character work afterwards. So I wish I wasn't like that, but I'm not someone who can write down a list of like, does my character like coffee or tea? What is their motivation? I don't even know that half the time. So yeah. I'm very, and then I have to scramble. So like, I don't necessarily recommend that, but I'm very haphazard when it comes to creating characters. So this is a good chat for me.
I find those like very systematic lists of things. I end up spending so much time on them because I'm like, oh, this is what it means to build a character. But then it's like, you get so hung up. And then eventually when I'm like, all right, I have a character and I start writing them. And then I'm like, well, I wrote that they like coffee, not tea. So I have to make them like this. And then I find like I just write myself into corners because I'm so focused on like the rules I made for them, and it just feels better and more natural just to write it and kind of see what happens.
Yeah. And leaving a lot of those things open-ended leaves you so much more room to like if you need something from them later and you haven't locked in something just for the sake of locking it in, of like, oh, they like tea, but then there's like I don't know why there would be some sort of coffee plot.
Coffee related plot twist.
Yeah. So it's leaving things open-ended so you have room to discover it later. But I am very much the same way as Erin, where I don't do a lot of it, but I liked Emma's way of putting it, of like, I don't do a lot of conscious work on it. It's kind of there in the back of my head. And then I kind of get to know them as I go and then polish it up in edits. But it's something I'd like to be better at as well, because they are the most important part of a story. So it's a lot of pressure, I think, to figure out exactly who they are before you jump in, but anyone who can do it.
Yeah,
I think
and it also... Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think one of the things I find hardest is figuring out like why they have a certain motivation. That always like takes me a while. Like I can usually figure out a motivation, like something that they want, but like kind of like figuring out the why and like the background of it a lot of times can be really difficult.
Wow. I really feel attacked. Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Usually when I have usually I start out with what I think is a motivation for the character, and then it often is just like, it's not enough. You know, like there's no way that this person would do all this stuff just for that, or like there's no reason why that's their motivation. And usually if I have like a long editor list, like that's the main thing they're telling me is like her motivation doesn't make sense, or it's not strong enough, or whatever. And like I can rewrite things multiple times and still not, like, that's one of my weaknesses for sure, is figuring out like, why is she motivated by this, and like, where does that come from, right? Like, what in her past has made her motivated by this? So
yeah, that's one of the things, like, I feel like I'm pretty good at, oh, well, I'll just throw this plot thing away, I'll just get rid of this, get rid of that. But when, I guess that's why I said earlier, like, I like to know what the character's trajectory is going to be, is because if I write a book and I don't know at least a starting and end point, then like it's really messy for me in the revisions process. I have a really hard time parsing out, well, what things are happening because plot and what things are happening because character. And I have a hard time bridging the gap if I don't have some idea of that at the start. We did have a semi-related question because we were talking a bit about character sheets. Where did it go? It's from Penumbra Mine. Said, I write personality profiles even on side characters. Do you think that's putting too much into them?
No.
If it works for you, it works for you.
Yeah, I'd rather have that information. I just get too impatient. So if building that, all of that ahead of time helps you, definitely can not see it being a bad thing.
I almost feel always like a little bit jealous of people who can do that. And like, same with world building, when they know all the details of their world, like J.K. Rowling or whatever, who like knows so-and-so's grandpa's history. It's like, I wish I was like that so that the world felt more real. Like, you're not necessarily including all of those things in the manuscript, but you know. And it's the same with when they're doing like an interview and someone asks like a question. They don't like, I feel like oftentimes someone will ask me a question. I'll be like, I should know this about my own world, but I don't.
It's not in the book, so I don't know.
When people ask me that, I make something up. And then I
on the spot.
later.
Well, you see.
And Elizabeth Fairfax had a good point. She said, I need character sheets so all my characters aren't blue-eyed and blonde. And I think that is like one of the like pros to creating sheets like that, is it helps you like keep things straight and also like make sure that you're not doing like too much of one thing. You know, it's like, wow, I gave every single character in this book this one personality trait from myself.
Not only that, but like I have a character Bible now because I've been so notoriously terrible in the past with like Witches, Fashion, Ruin. I'm trying to write book 2. Everybody's eye colors keep changing. It's like Lord of the Rings when Legolas is like, I have blue eyes, now I have brown eyes, now I have blue eyes. Like, you should know your character's eye colors and write these things down.
Yes. In the book that Kyra and I wrote together, we have one character whose eye color changed so many times. There was one chapter where they were described as both a thunderstorm and molten copper. Chapter.
I had one book, I don't remember which one it was, but like there was a character in it that like had like 4 different names. Like I kept accidentally changing because I forget what name I gave them earlier in the book.
All the time. Or I have given like my character one last name and then give her another last name later. Or like I named like a store or something, or like a bar in the city was like McFlanagan's or something. And then my character was like, I'm so-and-so McFlanagan. And my editor was like, does she own the bar? Or...
Like, listen, I only have about 5 last names in my head, and everybody's got to have those.
I just recycle them.
I can only afford 5. Like,
Okay. So like our last workshop, this is going to be part write-in, where we work through some exercises together, and then part writing chat, where we'll be talking about the ins and outs of character creation like this. And then if you have any questions at all about any of this, please feel free to continue putting them in the discussion section. You don't need to be at any particular point in the writing process. Hopefully everything I put together will be helpful, whether you are making new characters or trying to flesh out some existing ones. But before we do any of that, we're going to talk a little bit about what makes a memorable character. This is mostly because I like talking about like TV characters and all of those things and like why they are amazing. So first I'm going to try to figure out sharing the right screen. Okay, Kelly screen.
ooh, wow.
Wow.
Slides. So I want to kick things off by talking about characters that are already out there in the universe. Hopefully everyone is fairly familiar with at least a couple of these. For the middle one, it is, I don't even know how to say his name.
Geralt?
It's the Witcher guy. Sure.
Geralt.
I haven't seen the show, but I wanted to pick a video game person. But if we're talking about the TV person, that's cool too. So we want to talk a little bit about what makes these characters great. So just a question to the word nerds. What comes to mind about any of these and what makes them a strong character? Like for me, I immediately love the idea of Janet as an all-knowing robot. So like, what is a character trait about any of these people that are like, oh, that's a great character?
I don't know. I just know that I love Troy from Community so much because he's just he's like lovable and like, you know, he's a little bit stupid, but he's also big-hearted and very like fiercely loyal as a friend.
He's very
someone
earnest.
you want to hang out with him.
I think one of the great things about Captain Holt from Brooklyn Nine-Nine is his character arc and development is part of what's really great about him. Like when you look at him in like season 1, when he comes in like very strict, like he doesn't want to get in on any of the jokes or anything. And then like he like slowly like to see him like loosen up and like change around the group has been like a really great, while still being totally himself. Having almost no sense of humor, but he does have a sense of humor, and you start to like see that come out. And he like bonds with the characters, and I think that's a really great part of him.
Yeah, and I think with Geralt, you get a lot of really interesting kind of moral questions, like a huge crux of the books. I don't know the video game as well as I know the books, but I have played the video game some. Just the whole idea of like humans versus monsters and where the line gets blurred. And then this fact that he kind of creates a line of like, okay, well, I'm not going to hurt these people that you might think are monsters. Like it just raises all these interesting questions. And also, you know, having a child thrust upon you and being forced to raise them is always a fun, endearing plot line.
I also think how closed off Geralt is like makes him really interesting too, that he's not a very open character and you don't know a ton about him.
That he's not open, but also compassionate, but also will like totally murder you.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting conglomeration of features.
Yeah.
I find it interesting as I'm looking at this like collage of characters that I can pin down more in a cement way the two fantasy characters' motivations versus the characters from something contemporary. I don't know. I just make that observation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like there's a more obvious goal for fantasy characters.
Yeah.
Because there's more likely to be like a quest or something involved.
Yeah. Or like the backstory is why their motivation is this way versus like Troy. He doesn't really have, I mean, I can't think of a motivation.
Okay, but he's like 18 at the beginning. He doesn't have a backstory.
It's like contemporary and realism, like characters are just kind of trying to get through their life, just trying to like get through a
Mhm.
normal life. Where something like fantasy or sci-fi, it's like there is some big thing that
A
needs to be
deep
done.
motivation usually.
Yeah.
And I will
Yeah.
confess
I do
not to
think-
having seen Community, but I would suspect that the goal is to get through Community Con.
How dare you?
Unacceptable. I
I'm
do
sorry.
think with Holt, like his background as a gay black cop
Yes.
coming up in
Yeah,
New York
for
City
sure.
is a big part of who he is.
Yeah, and why he is the
So,
way he is.
They are,
And
yeah. It's just
yeah.
less dramatic with contemporary characters.
Yeah, and he does have a motivation of like that was his motivation to become the captain, and then to become what's it called? The next
Yeah,
He wants to be
commissioner.
commissioner.
Yeah,
Yes. So he does have a goal.
Mhm.
I'm finding it really interesting looking at Thanos versus Janet and thinking about how both of them try and see the world in a really logical way, but Thanos's conclusion of the
Just the
logical
worst.
way was like, just get rid of everyone, and Janet would never.
I
She
just
was-
rewatched Endgame today, which is why this came up for me, and like seeing Thanos. This is going to be a bit of a bit spoilery for the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, but the Thanos that dies at the beginning of Endgame, who's like seen it all and had horrible things happen, versus someone who the actual bad guy of Endgame, where Thanos is still just kind of power hungry for his goal, and like they're very different people, even though they're just a few years apart, and they're the same person. But I found that kind of interesting.
Yeah.
All right, so for our first exercise, we are going to be taking just a couple minutes to come up with a few of our own what makes a great character, thinking of some of your favorite characters, and then just a quick why are they a favorite for you, what made them stand out, what made them memorable. Like for me, I love Louise from Bob's Burgers because she's a bossy tyrant in a bunny hat, or Willow from
Yes.
Buffy because she was someone I wanted to be more like. So anything like that, of just trying to pin down a little piece of why you love your favorite characters. And I'm going to try to find some sort of timer. All right, we have a bit of 30 seconds to vamp here. Anyone has any favorite characters they'd like to throw out? This would be a great time.
I'm going to be writing about Gideon the Ninth.
Of course.
Oh. Maybe a fun one to try to pin down, like exactly why. Gideon.
Why I love her so much? Because she's my girlfriend.
Yeah, I don't know. I love Gideon. Yeah, there's a good reason. All right, so 2 minutes. Oh, 3 minutes is what I put in the slides. That's what we're doing. 3 minutes starting now. Go. And time. Anyone
Pencils
have any
down.
they would like to share with the class? Including in the comments, I'd love to hear what you all came up with. We'll definitely share some. But looking at what makes great characters great for you.
I will go because I figured something out right now.
Really?
Ooh.
Yeah, one of the reasons I love Gideon from Gideon the Ninth is because of the contrast between, because I did Gideon and then I moved on to Harrowhawk as well.
Hmm.
And I think I liked them because there's such a contrast with each other. Like both of them have these kind of a little bit tragic past, but Gideon has like coped with hers by becoming like, she's like powerful and strong and like in her spare time she does push-ups type of thing, but like she also has this ridiculous sense of humor and like cracks jokes and puns. Like she's as likely to like make a bad pun at you as to stab you. And then Harrowhawk is like totally completely earnest. She's serious and like kind of seems a bit like a jerk initially, but you realize like she's hiding this terrible secret from her past, and that's what's pushing her and motivating her to like be the best she can be type of thing. So yeah, and just the contrast between the two of them becomes so obvious the more you read, and like they really play off each other, which makes for great like enemies to lovers type of contrast. So yeah.
I thought it was interesting when you said you were going to do Gideon because I enjoyed the book, but I don't really like Gideon that much. But I love Harrow, and I'm really excited that Harrow is like the protagonist of the second book because I love her so much more.
Yeah, I don't think Gideon has, as much as I love Gideon, I don't feel like she has as much depth as Harrow.
Yeah.
Harrow
Her motivations aren't as
Harrow as a character has way more depth and way more backstory and motivation than Gideon.
Yeah, and I can only take so much of the like snark character. I feel like I enjoy like the slightly more earnest. I can take it in like small doses, but having her be the main character of the whole book is difficult for me.
Yeah. That's interesting because I also did one that's really more of like a twofer because I was recently watching what are those? It's like How It Should Have Ended, or it was not that one, but a different one that's like everything wrong with the Rise of Skywalker. And so I had Rey on my mind and was thinking about how much I really enjoy her character, particularly her character as a concept, just like this, just like feral girl who hasn't really gotten the chance to grow up yet, but really wants to and has all this power, kind of like any hero's journey hero realizes she has all this power, but then has the fun twist of also you're linked to the one person who you want to destroy. Like I find that really compelling and interesting as far as like a character journey goes.
Yeah, I just finished rewatching Schitt's Creek, so I have all of those characters in my mind, and I love all of them, but I particularly really love Stevie. I think she's a really interesting character because she's, in a way, so mundane. Like, she's just a typical person, you know, where, like, the rest of them, you're like, I'm never going to be some millionaire who, like, has to go move to a small town because my financial advisor stole all my money or whatever. But, like, just being, like, the normal girl who, like, started working in the motel that her family owned and now just like feels stuck there and doesn't really know where to go next in her life, I think she's a really like relatable character in a lot of ways.
Yes, I feel like there's something so like speaks to the reader in you when Stevie talks about, I feel like I'm watching your stories happen from behind my desk.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it's like we just watched that episode because we just finished rewatching season 5, and like it's so good.
I really like Jennifer's answer of Fred and George because they were someone I thought of when I was coming up for examples, and I couldn't pick one of them. And they're also fairly flat-ish, but they always stood out for me, particularly because of the grit and forge joke that she references in her comment there. That was like one of my favorite moments of book 1, and I don't know why, but their humor and I don't know. I always find twins interesting, but I love them so much. But I don't really have a good reason. They're just great.
They had a lot of laugh out loud moments in a book in a book series that's relatively dark. So like, yeah,
they're just kind of wonderful. All right. Moving on to our next section, which is adding in the details, which is where I really suck. But this is what actually made me want to do this workshop, because I had this idea about like generating characters based on all of these random things, like you can see in the slide there, that like we all have these ways of labeling ourselves and just like taking bits and pieces of some, of like figuring out my character's Hogwarts house. A lot of us do that, but adding in what their love language is, or like the Myers-Briggs personality types have so many different just kind of structures to make a person by, which I feel like I should just like assign my characters one of the Myers-Briggs types and call it a day. So I wanted to explore a little bit about the things that can be more difficult to flesh out your character, of like, yes, figuring out what they like and dislike is one thing, but actually figuring out what they value or how they show affection and that kind of stuff can be kind of tricky. So I'm just going to share this in the comment section.
Kelly, if you look at your screen sharing, it has a little white bar on the bottom, and if you click hide on that, it'll move it so we can see the whole slide.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, the bottom's for the kind of the next bit, but
perfect.
Okay, so in the comment section, I split it up into two, which is going to make that link kind of crappy. But just a rundown of, if you aren't familiar with any of these, each of these links has just a breakdown of the very basic, what kind of personality type goes with any of these groups. Because for our next activity, it's time to bring your own character into the mix, or if you don't have one, that is what the bottom is. I kind of made just a very basic template character of a Hufflepuff, who is a Leo, and a dragon in the Chinese zodiac, because that's what I am, and that's the only one I'm super familiar with, and has a love language of receiving gifts. So that's how they like to either show someone love, or how they most feel loved is when they get gifts. So there's a very basic template, and then so if you have your own characters for this next exercise, you can absolutely use them. Or if you're coming into it blind, feel free to start with my Hufflepuff over here. Feel free to change anything you want, because it's all just kind of a jumping off point to get us thinking about some of the smaller details we don't always think about. So for the next 5 minutes, we are going to take some time to write out what we already know about our characters' personalities, using these new lists to think about new facets of who they are. So if you're working from the template character, you can pick out a Myers-Briggs personality type and kind of see how that changes from this kind of more standard Hufflepuff, or if any of these things need to change. Or if you have a character you already know pretty well, think about how they give and receive affection. Pretty much just explore these sites, explore these personality traits, try adding something into the mix, and see if you come up with anything new. So just writing down what you know about this character's personality. So we're going to do 5 minutes, starting in 5 seconds.
That Myers-Briggs link as well, the one that got split.
Thank you very much. All right, we're going to start now, and we will check back in 5 minutes. And time. I don't know how many times I was caught on camera there trying to count out exactly how many minutes it was supposed to be. When will 5 minutes end? Also noticing typos when it's too late to do anything about them.
That happened to me too.
So when it comes to details for your characters, what kind of things do you tend to focus on? I'm looking through this list. I was trying to think through what details I know by the time it's all over and I've written my character, and which ones I've never even crossed my mind. Of like, I don't do a lot of physical details, I don't think. Like, I know my eye color, my hair color, but nothing interesting.
Same.
I try to get a physical quirk and a emotional quirk. So if it's physical, it's like, oh, they have a really prominent nose ridge, or they have a mole on their cheek, or they have dimples. But if it's an emotional one, it's like, oh, they chew their lip when they're nervous, or they always have a certain catchphrase that they say. And like that tends to help make
I
it a
like
little
the
bit
idea of a catchphrase.
more human.
Yeah. If
Oh,
was, like,
I say
physical
rad
quirks,
a lot.
if I
or
know
like if someone's
one,
like,
yeah.
Yeah.
or like someone's like, oh, that's so cool. I'm like, oh, rad, that's dope. Like that's just something that I'll say, and I
do
don't
say those
notice
things.
myself saying it.
Certain way of speaking.
I forgot. Now I kind of wish we'd done like write a word nerd as a character exercise. Could have been a lot of fun. And I feel like Rachel might have been the easiest
Next time.
because she has catchphrases.
Yeah, I don't like mean to say it. It just always comes out all the time.
I don't know if I have a
That would've been
catchphrase. I
great.
go through like cycles of words I use a lot and then get sick of them.
Yeah, I don't think I would have been able to tell you what Rachel's were if she wasn't aware of it, but I'm sure we all have them.
I know Megan has a very particular way of saying like so much
She
so that I have
does, you're right.
so much so that I have caught myself doing it and then been like, oh, that's Megan's way of saying that.
Okay, yeah, okay. We're gonna roll with this. Like, quick side exercise. If any of you can think of how you would describe another word nerd as a character.
Be nice though.
Yes. No. Yeah, no, like it's a little easier because we all know each other in person. But if any of you have any nice examples you want to give us in the comments, you're more than welcome.
If you have a mean one, you can write it down, but don't type it.
We don't want to know.
Email it to yourself. Jada R says, do you use tarot for character? And I have a video about that. Yes, I do. Quite frequently. Actually, more than character, though, I use it for like if I want to throw something really nasty or something really interesting or like a plot twist in my character's path. And I'm plotting, I will use tarot.
Yeah, I can see using that for plot. How would you use it for character?
You could apply tarot in different ways. So if you're creating a character, depending on what you pull, you could use it and interpret it that way to form a character's kind of like personality almost, or like the path they would take if they're like presented with certain decisions. So yeah,
Maybe kind of like moods for their backstory. If like you don't have the specifics, but
yeah,
you get a sense of.
I don't have my tarot here. I was going to pull a card and use an example, but now I can't find it.
Yeah, because I am trying to think of more of those things like the star signs or the Myers-Briggs of like I want to make a character generator that like gives you just a bunch of these things of like here is your Slytherin words of affirmation loving dog year born, etc., etc.
I find like the Myers-Briggs and even like the like Hogwarts house, like some of the personality like tests can be helpful just because they force you to think about things and things other than just like, do they like coffee or tea, but things like, like what do they prioritize? What, like I was looking at the Myers-Briggs test and like one of them was about like what's something you like wish you could improve in yourself. Like I think that's really telling about a character. So just like makes you kind of start to think about that. Rather than just like what's convenient in the moment in the story.
Yeah. I always feel so daunted by doing a whole test for a character because like I've done it for myself and it takes a long time. And like if I don't know the answer, I feel like the whole thing's gonna be skewed. But I really like the like set up personality types of like the inspector of like, just as a general thing I can start from.
Yeah. I always find myself really impressed with little details when I'm reading a book where I'm particularly liking the character. Like if they particularly, someone mentioned earlier in the chat that they like to put their characters in a diner situation, like write a scene with their characters in a diner and look at all of the little things they do. Like how do they treat the waiter? How do they tip? Like all of these random things. And I always find little details like that I love and I try to put in when I'm planning out a character, because like, yeah, I care about whether they like coffee or tea or water, but it tells me, I like the little details that tell me a lot more about who they are as a person. And sometimes when I get really into the Myers-Briggs and stuff, I fall down this big rabbit hole of like, well, would an ISTP prefer the trampoline or the track?
That was actually one of the exercises I was almost going to do, of like write your character waiting at a bus stop, and then I was going to put in some other characters, because there's so many different exercises we could do on character, of like there's so much we can do here, and I'm sure we'll do more talks on this topic in the future, but it's so complicated because you're trying to make whole people.
Yeah. Like the Myers-Briggs test I think would be really good if you were like first forming a character and you're like, let me figure out exactly what they're like. And then you can go like, okay, I choose the commander, and now I'm going to like read about all the stuff she's like, right? And it kind of like, it's like a full character there for you almost. Like if you really don't know what your character's personality is, you have one laid out for you essentially. And then you could know how that person would react with each of your plot points, which is great if you're like me and you really only have a plot and no characters in it.
Yeah. And that's why it's helpful for me as well. And I find like the Myers-Briggs ones and maybe the Zodiac signs as well help me to look at character traits that I don't have. So I never think to give them to people. Because like it's just not something in the forefront of my mind. Of like, almost made a Libra character earlier who was very gentle and thoughtful and loving. Of like, that's never the character I make, but I should have different kinds of people in my worlds. But, so it's just a good kind of template.
I can't just have all Slytherins in all of my books. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, I also think it can be really helpful to look at the like similarities and differences between your characters too. So that, you're like, I have like, it's this whole group of Slytherins, but like there's like one Hufflepuff in the group, and like how does that affect the dynamic of the group?
That is literally my
love
friend
that
group.
dynamic. Make it a group full of girls that are Slytherins and one Hufflepuff boy. I will read it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Because there's also always trying to balance of like characters who would naturally be drawn to each other, but still adding in that level of conflict of Slytherins and Hufflepuffs and all of that. So. All right, we only have a few minutes, 15 minutes or so left, so we're going to jump into our final section, which is character arcs, because this is something I struggle with. So looking at your character's journey from the beginning of your story to the end. So I tried to pull up some interesting character arcs from just kind of pop culture stuff, and I was really struggling. Like there were so many characters that you don't like at the beginning, but you like by the end. And I was trying to think of any examples of going the other way, of someone I loved at the beginning of a show or a movie or whatnot, and then by the end they were just ruined, of like a reverse Sawyer. I don't know.
Adam from Shatter Me series.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
That's
actually a really good example.
And actually, not necessarily like, I don't necessarily not like her at the end, but Britta from Community started out that like they even make a reference to it in like a kind of a meta way, because they're like, you started out as a collective anarchist, what happened to you, in like a reference to that, and she's like, I don't know. So they reference it, but yeah, she becomes like kind of a joke after being an anarchist and an activist and like very sure of herself. She becomes this like just like a punchline essentially at the end, which I
at the beginning
didn't know if I liked that.
Yeah, maybe they took it too far, but I felt like at the beginning you were seeing her how she wanted to see herself.
Yeah,
and then it's kind of like, no, this is who she really is. Of like, who's actually got the energy for all of this anarchy?
I feel like Game of Thrones had some characters that I liked less over time, but I don't know if that's a good character arc or if it was just bad writing in the TV show. So
That's the thing.
the fact that I ended up kind of hating Tyrion at the end, I think it may have been bad writing.
Yeah.
UBC Down, Forest of a Thousand Lanterns has a really good anti-hero arc. Anakin from the prequels, like for all of their quirks, I feel like that character arc was very smooth and well done, and you definitely hate him by the end.
It's true.
Yeah, I can think of. I want to think of more book characters that I hated, but I like looking at my bookshelf.
I feel like there's probably like we mentioned Adam from Shatter Me. There's probably some other love interest examples, but Gale in the Hunger Games is like that for me. Like I liked him fine in the first book, but by the third book, like he really annoyed me and really frustrated me. I think that was intentional.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely.
And I Darken series also does a very good job of this. I won't say which characters though because spoilers.
Gale from the Hunger Games is actually a really good example of something that I think was very well done and deliberate because he becomes radicalized, right, by the events going on in the book. And I think that was really well done.
Yeah, it's handled more like the opposite of where you start out hating a character and grow to love them because of actual changes that have happened to them.
Yeah.
So we can broaden this up as well. If you have any other examples of character arcs you really loved or have always stuck with you, those are always great. And then when good books become bad media, yes.
All the time.
Far too often.
Yeah.
And Leah pointing out that Zuko's character arc is the absolute best. I don't know. Looking at the top 3 on that thing, I really like all of them.
I love Petra so much.
I love Petra so much.
Yes.
And I can't even point to like when I realized I liked Petra. Like, oh, she was the worst at the beginning, and then it just like she's the only one I'm rooting for.
Slowly became my second favorite character. Potentially my favorite.
Who was the other?
Jane.
Okay.
I mean, you have to.
Yeah. She's fairly straightforward. Not a super interesting character arc there.
Yeah.
All right.
Remains the same, yeah.
So we are going to jump into our final exercise of the evening, where we will be taking 3 minutes at first to write a scene where your character is doing anything that makes them happy that takes place before your story starts or their story starts. So something just kind of mundane, nothing all that interesting has happened to them yet. And then we're going to take another 3 minutes right after that, and I'll let you know when we're at the halfway point, to write them doing the same thing, so same activity or something that makes them happy, but after the story has ended. So they have changed as a person in some way, and how you're going to get that across on the paper. So a few things you can keep in mind is who your character is at the beginning of the story, who will they be at the end, what has what they want changed at all over the course of their story and why, and I certainly hope it has. But if you don't have a story in mind to go with your character yet, just give it some thought and see what comes up. What is your character willing to sacrifice to get what they want? How will making that sacrifice have changed them by the end? And then what are they going to want next? In some ways, characters are these static beginning and end points, but having a sense of what's next for your character after the end of the book, at the end of their character arc, unless they have died, in which case this probably isn't going to be a super great scene to write. They're going to want something else next. They're going to be moving on with that next stage of their life. So give that some thought. No right or wrong answers. Just see what comes out. So we'll take 3 minutes for the first bit, starting in just a few seconds, and then I'll let you know at the halfway point when you're going to switch over to writing what their life is like and who they are after their story has ended. So we will kick that off now, and I will let you know in 3 minutes. that is the 3-minute mark. If you want to switch over to writing the after. And time. Obviously, 6 minutes is not enough time to do something like this, but we're trying to fit this within our usual hour, and you can totally feel free to continue any of these exercises in the future once we're done any of that, and hopefully it'll help figure out some character arc type things, because that can be difficult. So now I would like to open the floor to Megan to talk about why it's not as difficult as I think it is. Maybe, hopefully.
Sure. I love character arcs.
Yeah. Why do you love it?
And now I'm always going to be thinking about it. But I love character arcs. I think that we spend so much time thinking about plot, not really considering the fact that your characters are your plot. And so where your plot ends up should be a mirror reflection of where your character ends up. And so obviously it's still hard coming up with a book ending, but it should be as critical as figuring out your ending is for you if you are the kind of writer who likes to know your ending before you go in. If you're thinking about like, what is my character going to do to set things in motion, then yeah, you should probably also think about what's my character going to do to stop things from moving, and how is it going to affect them emotionally, because we don't do anything that doesn't affect us emotionally in real life. I feel like every time I do something, I have to sit there and be in my feels for like 5 minutes thinking about it. And so to put your character in many cases, since we write a lot of fantasy, in life or death situations, and then like not consider what that's going to do to them emotionally, it really does a disservice and creates a lot of problems for you in revisions. Not that it's impossible to fix it in revisions, because it is, but I've personally found that when I don't know, like, oh, well, I want them to go here, end up here, maybe this is where they have to sacrifice the thing they didn't want to sacrifice. When I know those beforehand, it takes less time in revisions. So it's kind of, you front load your work a little bit so that you don't have to do it quite so much or change quite so much of your plot in the end. Yeah. So that's why I love figuring out my character arcs ahead of time.
I just find it hard to like figure out the nuance of how a character will change. Of like, even looking at pop culture characters, it's never obvious. Very rarely are they a totally different person. So it's finding those little ways that they've changed and how to show it in a way that is still that same character. So it's definitely tricky, but
yeah, I do write a lot of characters who are morally gray, which does make it a little bit easier to be like, oh, well, I want them to be worse or I want them to be better. But again, looking at the small details, like for my scene, one of my characters has to wear gloves because plot. And so I like the opening scene I did was them being really anxious about taking the gloves off at the end of the day. And then the ending scene, I would like that character to be able to take the gloves off and feel invigorated or like refreshed by that. And it's such a small thing, but it feels big.
Yeah.
About the whole picture.
Misty Kate asked if I can upload the slides as a PDF. Megan, is there a way? What would you recommend for?
Yeah,
share that?
You can probably export it as a PDF. What I did for the last workshop was I just put the whole Google presentation on the WORNERDS Google Drive and then got a share link for it.
That's a good idea. Then yes.
And then you can make a copy to your own personal Google Drive and export it however you would like.
Alrighty.
And Kelly, I will say to you saying it's like hard because obviously they're still the same person at the end. So like their personality hasn't drastically changed. I find what's really helpful rather than thinking about their personality being different is thinking about how they see the world and how that has changed. Because especially when you're writing something like fantasy, like that is definitely going to change for them. Like if they're very idealistic at the beginning, maybe they've become jaded for some reason, or maybe, you know, they used to be really jaded and now they've realized that there are some good people out there. So seeing how they like
find those ones are easier to write of like looking at the Sawyers and the Petras. It's so like they're different people at the end and in such a clear way. So it's the more subtle, especially of like the ones who start out as more traditional heroes, that it's not going to be that big, obvious, oh, I've opened up to new people and all of that.
I know that, yeah, like the Petras and the Sawyers out there are all very morally gray, which, as Megan was saying, is an easier thing to do. And like the last manuscript I was working on, they were morally gray characters. And again, yeah, it's so much easier to be like, see, they're a better person now. But the one I'm working on now, the one I did the exercise for, yeah, she's like pretty much starts out as a hero in the beginning because it's middle grade and they frown on morally gray characters a little bit. But yeah, so it's hard to show how they've changed. But I like what Kelly you said about, or sorry, Emma, what you said about the character having a different perspective on things. And like, because I realized when I was doing the exercise that like she knows a lot more stuff that she didn't know at the beginning. Like she's been told a lot of false narrative about the past and her world. And then in the end, she's basically had her eyes opened. And so she's going to naturally see things very differently. So that's an easier way of making like, look, the character's changed because she knows all the stuff that she didn't know before. Those were the plot twists earlier. You know, like,
or she's like experienced things that have,
Well, I was thinking about Arya Stark instead of Sansa Stark, of like, she kind of became who she wanted to be, but the experience to get there did not turn her into the person she thought she was going to be.
Yeah, she kind of realized the person she always thought she wanted to be, like, she had to grapple with whether she really wanted to be that or not.
There's also, you think of like your Blue Sergeant, who like, she's fundamentally the exact same as she is at the beginning, but she is much more self-assured in like herself as a person. She is ready to go out and take some of the things that she only like thought about going out and getting before, and looking at who is with her now. She's not doing those things alone. She has like this found family of friends with her to supplement her real family or whatever. And so it's like she didn't change much, but she had a lot happen, and she still did very deeply grow, I guess. So it's like you're not making yourself into a different tree. You're just getting more roots. Tree metaphors, because Raven.
I like that. That's good.
Yeah. And like the first exercise we did, there's a lot of ways you can take the characters you love and learn from them and how their arcs work and how those were created, and then kind of adapt that to what you need and start to kind of grow their own character arc from there. But it's tricky, but there's a lot of great examples out there, and I got tea.
Oh, that's so nice.
My throat's getting raw from talking to it so much, so the last exercise made me like, how much do you love me? But we have been going for about an hour. So was there anything else we wanted to touch on in the great world of character creation? I feel like there's so much more we can get into. But
We talked a lot about particularly the creation of the characters, and I don't want that to sound discouraging if you're here working on revisions. I do still think there's so much you can do with figuring out like the branches of the tree that your character is becoming. I think that it's completely possible to look at, okay, well, what is going on in the plot? And sometimes you can like, oh, well, if this thing happens in the plot, that means that my character should probably change emotionally this way. Like not every time. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to rewrite your book because you didn't know your character arc from the beginning. I guess is what I'm trying to say. It just means that you need to be aware of it as you're restructuring your scenes, because maybe emotionally your character will need to react differently, even if the events happening are the same. So like, it's a big daunting thing, but you can do it. Yeah.
Alrighty, we will be back next week for a write-in if you want us to take any of these characters, new or old, out for a test drive. We'll be here at 7:30 Sunday, same time, same place. And of course, we will have our regular videos on Tuesday and Thursday. Thank you all so much for joining us. This was a lot of fun. We will be doing another Word Nerd workshop at some point in the future. But for now, have a wonderful evening, and we will see you all next time. Bye.
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 Bye.